What if I told you that right now, hidden deep inside Texas, one of the most powerful states in America, there are places the government quietly buried in paperwork, fenced off with rusted wire, or simply let the desert swallow whole? Places soaked in secrets, toxic contamination, forgotten silver fortunes, and stories that were never supposed to reach you. Stay with me, because this list will change how you see the Lone Star State forever. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now. We uncover the stories America forgot to hide better.
Number 10. Shafter, Texas. The silver ghost town they stopped talking about. Deep in the jagged folds of Presidio County, roughly 18 miles north of the Mexican border town of Presidio, sits a place that once produced more silver than almost anywhere else in the United States. Today, Shafter looks like a fever dream, crumbling stone walls baking under a relentless West Texas sun, a cemetery full of weathered crosses, and a rusting mine frame that looms over the silence like a forgotten skeleton. Most Americans have never heard of it, and frankly, that's not an accident. Shafter's story begins in 1880, when a civilian Army employee named John Spencer was traveling near the Chinati Mountains and noticed a ledge of rock that seemed to sparkle differently than everything around it. He brought a sample to Colonel William R. Shafter, the commander stationed at Fort Davis, who had it assayed. The results were staggering. Profitable amounts of silver were locked inside that rock. What followed was a classic American land grab, dressed up in military clothing. Colonel Shafter, along with two fellow officers, quietly petitioned the state of Texas to sell them the surrounding acreage, individually to avoid scrutiny, while verbally agreeing to split the profits with Spencer. They secured 2,560 acres. A California mining group soon swooped in, formed the Presidio Mining Company, and the real operation began.
At its peak in 1940, Shafter had a population of nearly 4,000 people. Miners, merchants, Mexican laborers, and Black American workers carved their lives out of that brutal desert, hauling ore by mule-drawn wagon until a tramway was built in 1913. The Shafter mine ultimately produced over 30 million ounces of silver, accounting for roughly 90% of Texas's entire silver output. 30 million ounces. That number is almost too large to comprehend for a remote corner of West Texas most people can't find on a map. And then it ended, not with a bang, but with a corporate decision. In 1942, the American Metal Company, facing a shortage of miners and rising production costs, simply shut everything down. Families scattered. Buildings were left standing as if their owners had just stepped out for lunch. Today, Shafter is home to perhaps a few dozen people, fenced ruins, a locked church, and mine shafts that still hold untold secrets beneath the Chihuahuan desert floor. Portions of the property are fenced off and close to visitors. Interestingly, the 1971 sci-fi film The Andromeda Strain used Shafter as its fictional ill-fated village, the perfect stand-in for a place the outside world was never supposed to enter.
Number 9. Terlingua, Texas, the mercury town where the ground is still poisoned. Most people who hear Terlingua today think of chili cook-offs, quirky desert bars, and the edge of Big Bend country. What they don't think about is the fact that this seemingly charming ghost town is riddled with unmarked mine shafts, mercury-contaminated soil, and zones that carry official warning signs telling you not to enter, not just to protect the crumbling buildings, but to protect you from what the earth absorbed over decades of industrial poison. Terlingua sits in Brewster County, deep in the Chihuahuan Desert near the Rio Grande. In the mid-1880s, cinnabar, the bright red ore from which mercury is extracted, was discovered in the volcanic mountains surrounding the area. The discovery triggered something between a gold rush and a corporate takeover. By 1903, a Chicago businessman named Howard E. Perry had founded the Chisos Mining Company, which would go on to become the largest mercury producer in the entire United States. At its peak during World War I, when mercury was essential for detonating weapons, the mine was generating $2,000 in profit every single day. Perry built himself a mansion on the hill, overlooking the town like a feudal lord surveying his holdings. The workers below him were a different story. Mexican immigrant laborers, many of whom had crossed during the Mexican Revolution seeking safety, worked in brutal conditions deep underground. They were exposed to toxic mercury vapor with little to no protection. Mercury poisoning shortened lifespans dramatically. Many workers died in their 30s and 40s. The cemetery, which opened in 1902, grew rapidly. Workers were buried under simple handmade crosses. Some graves had no markers at all. Their families stayed. Their spirits, many locals insist, never left. By 1943, the demand for mercury had collapsed. The Chisos Mining Company had filed for bankruptcy, and Terlingua became a true ghost town almost overnight. Perry reportedly told workers the mine was closed, they had lost their jobs, and the town was done, all in the same breath. For close to 3 decades, the ruins stood silent. Today, faded warning signs still mark the most contaminated zones near the old mine workings. Underground shafts honeycomb the hillsides, some unmarked and dangerously unstable. The mercury-laced soil in certain areas remains a genuine environmental hazard. A small, fiercely independent community has grown up around the ghost town in recent decades, but the dangerous zones remain forbidden, a permanent reminder of what corporate ambition and silence can leave behind.
Number 8. Longhorn Army Ammunition Plant, Karnak, Texas, where they made the bombs and buried the evidence. Here is a place that most Texans living within 50 miles of it have never been told the full truth about. The Longhorn Army Ammunition Plant sits on 8,493 acres beside Caddo Lake in Karnak, Harrison County, one of the most ecologically unique and fragile wetland habitats in the entire United States. And right next to it, for over 5 decades, the U.S. government ran one of its most productive wartime bomb factories. The plant was established in 1942 after Monsanto Chemical Company selected the site with a $22.5 million federal contract to produce TNT. The connection to Karnak was not entirely coincidental. A young congressman named Lyndon Baines Johnson, who had already built strong ties to President Roosevelt and House Speaker Sam Rayburn, helped persuade the Army to place one of its new ammunition plants in this rural area adjacent to his wife, Lady Bird's hometown. By August 1945, the plant had produced over 414 million pounds of TNT. After World War II, it remained active, pivoting to manufacture solid-fuel rocket motors and pyrotechnic devices throughout the Cold War. In 1988, the facility was used to destroy Pershing 1 and 2 missiles under the terms of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, a process observed by both Soviet and American officials.
What was not as publicly observed was what the decades of manufacturing had done to the surrounding land. The plant operated for 55 years with virtually no environmental regulation. Toxic chemicals, including trichloroethylene and methylene chloride, were found in the groundwater. The soil and surface water were contaminated with perchlorate, a rocket fuel additive. Sediment samples from streams flowing toward Caddo Lake showed elevated levels of lead and mercury. In 1990, the Environmental Protection Agency added the Longhorn site to the National Priorities List as a federal Superfund site. Cleanup operations began in 1996 and, according to official documents, are still ongoing to this day. Much of the land was transferred to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in 2000 to become the Caddo Lake National Wildlife Refuge, but significant portions of the original 8,500 acres remain off-limits to the public because they are still contaminated. Some areas are clearly marked with signs instructing visitors to stay out. Scientists hired by independent conservation groups have argued that the Army has not fully characterized the extent of the contamination, and that groundwater contamination may be spreading in directions the official monitoring does not cover. The small community of Uncertain, Texas, whose very name captures the uncertainty about whether the area falls in Texas or Louisiana, operates 3 drinking water wells that border this Superfund site. Residents have been asking for answers for decades. You've made it through 4 of the most jaw-dropping forbidden places in Texas. Before we go further, if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time. Hit subscribe and the bell.
This is exactly the kind of content we make every week, and you don't want to miss what's coming next.
Number 7. Lobo, Texas, the desert town that is legally off-limits. There are ghost towns, and then there is Lobo. Most abandoned places in Texas have at least a historical marker, a county road leading to them, and the vague permission of public curiosity. Lobo has none of that. Lobo, located along U.S. Highway 90 in Culberson County, about 12 miles south of Van Horn, is posted as private property and officially described on its own website as not intended for settlement. That phrasing alone should raise the hair on the back of your neck. A whole town not intended for settlement. Lobo's story begins with water, the only thing that matters in the Trans-Pecos Desert. The Van Horn Wells Aquifer beneath the Lobo Flats was one of the only dependable water sources within 100 miles in any direction. The Southern Pacific Railroad discovered it and drilled a well in the 1880s, making Lobo a stop for steam locomotives crossing the brutal stretch between Van Horn and the Mexican border near Presidio. The town grew slowly, got a post office in 1907, and found its brief golden era in the 1940s, when ranchers and farmers arrived with visions of cotton farming. At its peak, roughly 100 people called Lobo home. For a West Texas desert town, that was remarkable. The name Lobo, Spanish for wolf, came from the packs of Mexican gray wolves that once roamed the surrounding high desert. Those wolves are long gone now, hunted to near extinction, and Lobo followed them. By the 1980s, decades of aggressive irrigation pumping had dropped the water table under the Lobo Flats by 70 to 90 feet. The aquifer that created the town was essentially gone. The cotton gin closed, the post office shuttered. By 1991, the last residents had left, and Lobo became one of the most modern ghost towns in Texas, abandoned not by a hurricane or a mine collapse, but by a slow, grinding environmental failure that nobody in power bothered to stop in time. In 2001, 3 friends from Frankfurt, Germany purchased the entire town for roughly $20,000 and began hosting experimental film festivals in the ruins, an utterly surreal twist that somehow feels perfectly Texas. But the property remains gated and off-limits to the general public. You can drive by on Highway 90 and see the rotting motel, the boarded-up gas station, and the brushy ruins baking in the desert heat, but you cannot go in. The sign says so. And in that lonely stretch of West Texas, there is nobody around to ask why. Number 6. Indianola, Texas, the second biggest port in Texas that sank beneath the bay. There is a granite marker standing on the shore of Matagorda Bay in Calhoun County, Texas, that marks the location of a courthouse. The courthouse itself is about 300 feet away, underwater, somewhere beneath the waves of the Gulf. Welcome to Indianola, once the second busiest port in all of Texas, a city of 5,000 people that no longer exists above the waterline. Indianola was founded in 1846 and grew with astonishing speed. At its peak, it was the primary entry point for thousands of European immigrants, particularly Germans, who poured into western Texas. It was the eastern end of the Southern Chihuahua Trail, the military road connecting the Texas coast to San Antonio, Austin, and eventually Chihuahua, Mexico. Steamships from Charles Morgan's New York-based line made it their Gulf terminus. The town had 4 newspapers, a railroad, a hospital built of shell concrete and lime, and the kind of confident permanence that frontier towns earn after decades of growth. In July 1869, Indianola made world history when the first shipment of mechanically refrigerated beef was transported from its docks to New Orleans, the beginning of the modern cold chain food industry. In 1875, the town was also the landing site for 2 shiploads of camels, imported as part of Jefferson Davis's experimental military supply program for the southwestern United States. This was a city doing genuinely historic things. Then came September 16, 1875. A hurricane with 110-mile-an-hour winds hit Indianola at sea level. The town was, as one newspaper report at the time described it, blown away. Between 150 and 300 people died. The town rebuilt, smaller, humbler, but determined. 11 years later,
On August 19, 1886, a second, more powerful hurricane came ashore and finished what the first had started. When the winds knocked over a kerosene lantern, fire completed the destruction. The county seat was moved to Port Lavaca. The post office was permanently closed on October 4, 1887. The town was declared dead.
Number 5. The FLDS Yearning for Zion Ranch, El Dorado, Texas. The compound the state tried to ignore. Schleicher County, Texas covers over 1,300 square miles and has a total population of roughly 3,000 people. It is one of the most remote counties in a state full of remote counties. And it was there, outside the small town of El Dorado, that a secretive religious organization quietly built one of the most controlled, surveilled, and ultimately shocking compounds in modern American history. The Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, led by the imprisoned Warren Jeffs, purchased 1,700 acres of land outside El Dorado in 2003. Construction began almost immediately and continued for years. Locals noticed the building activity but were told little. A limestone temple with a distinctive white tower rose out of the West Texas scrub brush. Fences went up. Armed guards were reportedly posted. The ranch was designed to be self-contained. It had its own water system, power supply, church facilities, school facilities, and housing for hundreds of followers. The entire compound was built around one man's absolute authority over every aspect of his followers' lives, including whom they married, when they married, and how old they were when they did.
In 2012, aerial footage captured by a Utah television news team flying over the ranch revealed new construction that even outside investigators found deeply unusual. Thousands of metal tubes, consistent with an elaborate underground cooling system, drainage channels that appeared to lead to underground spaces, and what a local builder claimed was a 30-foot statue of Warren Jeffs being constructed on the grounds. The compound was designed to keep the outside world out and keep its occupants inside. Access was forbidden to outsiders. In 2008, Texas authorities conducted a massive raid on the compound following reports of abuse. Over 400 children were removed. The case became one of the largest child custody actions in American history. Warren Jeffs, already convicted in Utah, was later convicted in Texas of sexual assault of a child and sentenced to life in prison plus a $10,000 fine. The ranch itself has changed hands since then, but remains a place of restricted access and dark history. A monument to what happens when absolute secrecy is allowed to fester on 1,700 acres of Texas desert.
Number 4. Fort Cavazos Underground Tunnels, Killeen, Texas. The classified underground nobody officially acknowledges. Fort Cavazos, for most of its history known as Fort Hood, is the largest active-duty military installation in the United States. Covering nearly 340 square miles of central Texas hill country, it is home to the 3rd Armored Corps and has housed more heavy weaponry, classified training programs, and military hardware than most small countries possess. Most Americans know it exists. What most Americans do not know is what lies beneath it. Beneath portions of Fort Cavazos runs a tunnel complex that local reporting has confirmed exists, but whose full extent, purpose, and contents remain classified. One section of the tunnel network has been used for known training exercises by 3rd Corps soldiers. A second tunnel in the same complex, according to a 2012 report from the Killeen Daily Herald, is off-limits to the public and is used for classified research and training. The full scope of what that research and training involves has never been publicly disclosed. Fort Cavazos has a long and layered history of operating programs that the public was not informed of until years or decades later. In the post-war period, the installation became a focal point for investigations into unusual aerial phenomena observed over the installation, documented in local Texas history archives. The base has hosted classified weapons testing programs, and its sheer size creates zones that are not just restricted from the public, but are genuinely inaccessible to most of the military personnel stationed there.
Getting too close to the wrong fence line on the perimeter of Fort Cavazos is not a misdemeanor situation, it is a federal one. The base also has an off-limits list maintained for its soldiers, bars and establishments in the surrounding communities of Killeen and Harker Heights that personnel are officially forbidden from visiting. That list is updated regularly and publicly posted. But the list of what lies underground, what those tunnels were built for, and what classified programs are currently active on those 340 square miles, that list has never been published anywhere.
Number 3. Belle Plaine, Texas, the courthouse town reclaimed by silence. In the 1870s, Callahan County was a place of enormous optimism. Settlers pushing westward into Texas had established a town called Belle Plaine on a rolling hilltop, and by the early 1880s, it was one of the most talked-about communities in all of West Texas. A newspaper at the time described it as one of the most promising towns in the region, writing that there was no more pleasant or beautiful place in all of Texas with brighter prospects for a prosperous future. Belle Plaine had a college, Callahan County College, one of the first in that part of the state, a courthouse, churches, businesses, and the kind of civic pride that builds monuments. The county courthouse was constructed of stone and stood as the architectural centerpiece of the town. The college, opened in 1881, brought professors, students, and the kind of intellectual life that frontier towns rarely achieved. For a few brief years, Belle Plaine had everything it needed to grow into a lasting city. Then the railroad chose differently. When the Texas and Pacific Railway laid its lines through the region, it bypassed Belle Plaine entirely and ran through Baird instead. Within a few years, businesses began relocating. Residents followed the railroad as they always did. The college closed, the county seat was moved. By the 1890s, Belle Plaine was a ghost town. The courthouse, the college, the newspaper offices, everything was either dismantled for materials or left to the weather. Today, the ruins of Callahan County Courthouse still stand in what was once downtown Belle Plaine, their stone walls slowly dissolving back into the limestone country from which they were built. The land is private, signs discourage trespassing, but those ruins represent something genuinely haunting, not just a town that failed, but a vision of Texas civilization that was erased by a railroad company's decision made in a boardroom hundreds of miles away. Belle Plaine is not famous. It is not on most Texas history lists. The ruins simply sit there, forgotten, a few miles outside of Baird, slowly returning to the earth.
Number 2. Shafter Historic Mining District Restricted Zones, the silver that's still there. We talked about Shafter at number 10, but what most people do not know is that the story of Shafter is not entirely past tense. While the ghost town is accessible from the highway, significant portions of the surrounding Shafter Historic Mining District remain fenced, posted, and completely off-limits to the public. Not because of government bureaucracy, but because of what is still down there. The Shafter Mine Complex was a massive industrial operation that tunneled deep into the Chinati Mountain limestone for over 6 decades. The underground workings were never fully mapped or publicly disclosed. Environmental surveys conducted over the years have confirmed that the old mine shafts, tunnels, and ore reduction facilities left behind significant contamination in the soil and groundwater. Some of the mine shafts were capped, but not all. Some were simply fenced off. The Presidio Mining Company's ore reduction mill, where 2 million tons of silver ore were processed, left behind chemical residue that persists in the surrounding terrain to this day. Portions of the Shafter Mining District were added to the National Register of Historic Places in 1976, but that designation is about preservation, not access. The underground tunnels that wind beneath the Chinati Mountains remain sealed and forbidden. In 2012, a Canadian mining company called Orcana Corporation actually reopened one of the original silver mines at the Shafter site, demonstrating that there is still economically viable silver in the ground. A subsequent acquisition by James Bay Mining Company continued that work. What that means is that Shafter is not simply a place where silver once existed, it is a place where silver still exists, beneath fences and locked gates and posted no trespassing signs in an area of West Texas that the state has never fully explained to the public. Number 1. The Caddo Lake Chemical Corridor. Uncertain, Texas. The number one forbidden place in Texas is not a dramatic military base or a collapsed mine. It is something more insidious, a place of extraordinary natural beauty that sits directly on top of one of the most contaminated former industrial sites in the American South, whose full extent of damage has been deliberately downplayed by the very government agencies responsible for cleaning it up. Caddo Lake is often called the only natural lake in Texas, and its cypress forests, some of the trees dating back 400 years, are among the most hauntingly beautiful landscapes in the entire southeastern United States. In 1993, the Ramsar Convention designated it a wetland of international importance. It hosts the highest diversity of plants in Texas and shelters rare species, including the peregrine falcon. People come from across the country to photograph the Spanish moss draped over ancient bald cypress trees jutting from the murky, mirror-still water. What the tourism brochures do not tell you is that for 55 years, a bomb factory sat on the shore of this precious ecosystem. The Longhorn Army Ammunition Plant manufactured TNT, rocket motors, and pyrotechnic devices next to Caddo Lake from 1942 to 1997, operating for most of that time with zero environmental regulation. Trichloroethylene and perchlorate were routinely dumped into the ground. When the EPA listed the site as a Superfund location in 1990, the cleanup that followed was, according to independent scientists hired by conservation organizations, fundamentally incomplete. The small community of Uncertain, Texas, a town of roughly 150 residents whose very name comes from early surveyors' uncertainty about whether the land was in Texas or Louisiana, operates drinking water wells directly adjacent to the contaminated property. Residents have spent years demanding answers about whether their water is safe. Scientists hired by the Caddo Lake Institute, a nonprofit conservation group, presented evidence that the Army's own groundwater monitoring failed to cover the full extent of the contamination. That contaminated groundwater was almost certainly flowing in directions not being tracked, toward the lake, toward the wells, toward the families who live there.
Texas is a state that prides itself on its fierce independence and its refusal to be told what to do. Yet the 10 places on this list tell a different story. A story of mines sealed without full disclosure, of towns abandoned when the water or the silver or the railroad money ran out, of bomb factories built next to pristine wetlands, and of compounds built to keep the world out while hiding what was happening inside. These are not conspiracy theories. They are documented history, federal Superfund listings, court records, and census reports. The forbidden places of Texas are not hidden in some classified vault. They are sitting right there on the landscape, behind fences, beneath bay water, under desert sand, waiting for someone to look closely enough to ask the right questions. Now that you know where to look, the question is, what are you going to do with that knowledge? If this video opened your eyes to a side of Texas you never knew existed, please subscribe right now. We cover stories just like this every single week. Drop a comment below telling us which place shocked you the most. I personally want to know. And share this video with someone who thinks they know everything about Texas. I promise you, they don't. See you in the next one.